Hey everybody. My name is Wayne Hendricks, if you don't know, and I am an IT guy, and basically also just a very inquisitive person, and I like to find out things. And when I get stuck, I believe in asking for help, and I'm at that point where I need help. So I'm going to run through a scenario that I think, and I need somebody out there, anyone, friends in legal fraternity. If you guys have an opportunity, just read through this with me and help me because I really want to understand: am I reading the legislation and the Constitution correctly? So I want to just start with the Constitution, and we probably have one of the best constitutions in the world. I do believe that, and I do believe that it does protect people, and we have a Bill of Rights that is there to protect us as well. So I'm a firm believer in our Constitution. Is it perfect? By no means. Is it equitable? Who knows? Those are not the questions that I want to answer today. So first off, I just want to look at Chapter 6 of the Constitution, and specifically Section 146. And this is the conflicts between national and provincial legislation. The reason I'm doing this is because I took a read through of the Disaster Management Act, and this section is highlighted in the Disaster Management Act of 2002. So, Section 146.6 basically says a law made in terms of an act of parliament or provincial act can prevail only if that law has been approved by the National Council of Provinces. Fantastic. So basically, if government wants the National Council of Provinces to pass a law, they must send it to the National Council of Provinces. They approve the law, then goes to the National Assembly. National Assembly then sends it to the President, and it gets gazetted and it becomes law in South Africa. That's the process, and that's how it works. But the Disaster Management Act is very specific about that point. And we'll get to it, but first I want to cover just what the Disaster Management Act is about. Put it into context. So us guys who live here in Cape Town, we have a nuclear power station on our doorstep. And if something goes wrong with that nuclear power station, meltdown, whatever, the Disaster Management Act can come into play. So the Disaster Management Act covers either a national disaster, a provincial disaster, or a local municipal disaster. And there are sections that detail the formulation of a disaster management plan, the establishment of a disaster management center, the ministers that are in charge. There's a whole bunch of regulations relating to remuneration and all of those things, and they all good for the establishment of disaster management plans. Now, COVID-19, we didn't have a disaster management plan for it. I don't believe we did. I don't believe government had done their work on a pandemic and decided that this is the way we are going to do it. It's not feasible because I don't think anybody has actually seen a documented disaster management plan for a pandemic in this country. So that's all good and well. But we're in a crisis at the moment, and we're in a situation where people are dying as a result of a disease, and we're trying to stop the spread. And lockdown, in my mind, was probably the best thing to do at the start. Is it the best thing to do now? I have reservations and second thoughts about that. But the thing is, I don't want to lose people I love, so kind of selfish in that way. But that's besides the point. The questions I have come to the declaration of a national disaster, and those are covered under Chapter 3, Part 2, Section 27 of the Act. It says, in the event of a national disaster, the Minister may, by notice in the Gazette, declare a national state of disaster if existing legislation and contingency arrangements do not adequately provide for the national executive to deal effectively with the disaster, or other special circumstances warrant the declaration of a national state of disaster. COVID-19 is a national disaster. There's no doubting it. We cannot get away from it. It is unprecedented in what it is in our lives and in our lifetime. So yes, a national disaster should have been declared, and that is correct. But there are regulations that govern the declaring of a state of disaster, and these are covered under Section 2. When we read through these, they're very basic and they're pretty broad, because if you realize you cannot have a disaster management act that covers everything. That's what the disaster management plan is for. So basically it deals with the release of resources, people, controlling how the plan is operated, evacuation of people to temporary shelters, regulation of traffic to and from, regulation of goods to and from, use of emergency accommodation, occupancy, whether people can stay in the area. And then an interesting one is the suspension and limiting of the sale, dispensing, transportation of alcoholic beverages in the disaster-stricken or threatened area. So I'm not going to deal with the alcohol ban here. I believe it's unfair, but it's in the regs. It's there. Then the maintenance of lines of communications to and from, dissemination of information, emergency procurement procedures, facilitation of response and post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation. And then point N, other steps that may be necessary to prevent an escalation of the disaster or to alleviate, contain, and minimize the effects of the disaster. And then lastly, steps to facilitate international assistance, of course. And then in subsection 3, it says the powers referred to in subsection 2, those guys I've just mentioned, may be exercised only to the extent it is necessary for the purposes of A, assisting and protecting the public, B, providing relief to the public, C, protecting property, D, preventing or combating disruption, or E, dealing with the destructive and other effects of the disaster. So it seems as though our government has gone and lumped everything into N. Basically, a whole bunch of rules and laws and regulations that prevent things like neighborhood watches, CPF, couriers transporting documents, hair salons, beauty salons, tourism, transportation is covered. But they've gone and they've put everything together and said, well, we're just going to put it all into other steps besides the more specific stuff. Okay. So alcohol covered, no doubt about that. I'm not even going to get into that. But sale of cigarettes, e-commerce, I am going to get into that because I do have questions. So my question would be, which portion of the Disaster Management Act gives government the right to ban something like e-commerce because of unfair competition on trade? In addition, courier services not being allowed to transport documents between businesses, which is absurd when you take people like accountants, bookkeepers who need documentation from the clients. Now, Mr. Klein now go and scan in his 22,000 receipts over the last year so that his bookkeeper can get his books up to date for his provisional tax or for things that are a requirement by law. So it's absurd for couriers not to be able to transport documents, but to be able to transport essential services. And then which section of the DMA gives the government the right to ban these things? So it must be N, read together with subsection 3E, which is dealing with the destructive and other effects of the disaster. But am I wrong? I don't know. I think that the Act is pretty clear. It's written in English, and it's pretty clear that that's probably where these regulations that have been published in the government gazettes are sitting. But this brings me then to what is a regulation. So these regulations are defined in the Act, in the descriptions as, this Act includes any regulation made in terms of Section 59. So Section 59 sits in Chapter 8, and it's very interesting because it provides a framework under which these regulations are published or promulgated or done or whatever you want to put it into. So it says in subsection 1, the Minister may make regulations not inconsistent with this Act, A, concerning any matter that, 1, must or may be prescribed in terms of the provision of this Act, so those ones in 27, subsection 2, or is necessary to prescribe for the effective carrying out of the objectives of the Act. So basically, any regulation that they feel should be made in terms of carrying out the objects of the Act can be made by the Minister. I'm happy with that. And that is exactly what has been happening. So they come along and they think of a regulation, let's ban cigarettes, and they ban cigarettes. They ban toy sales, for example, in supermarkets. Outdoor camping goods can't be sold. There's a whole bunch of things. If you go into any of your favorite stores, you'll see the shelves closed, marked off, and all of that. Alcohol, which forms part of the initial regulations, is covered. However, it says the selling or limiting of the sale of alcohol. So it could be allowed under certain conditions within the framework of the Disaster Management Act. But the interesting part of Section 59 is Part 4. And this is the one that I question. It says, any regulations made by the Minister in terms of subsection 1 must be referred to the National Council of Provinces for purposes of Section 146(6) of the Constitution. So help me if I'm wrong, please, my legal friends in the legal fraternity, politics, whoever you are. Am I right in understanding that under the Disaster Management Act, any regulation that is published must first go to the National Council of Provinces before it can make it through to the Gazette? Surely this is the process that needs to be followed when regulations are put together by the National Command Council. I can see no other reason why not. And I thought about it and was wondering, why would this sentence be here? And it's because some regulations in provinces differ to the regulations from national government. So an example would be smoking within 10 meters of a door may be the national requirement, but a provincial legislature can pass another law which is within 20 meters. So bylaws and provincial laws can be different from the national law. However, the national law will always trump the provincial law so long as that law has been approved by the National Council of Provinces. If that's true, then surely the regulations we are currently under, if they have not been approved by the National Council of Provinces, and I cannot find any meeting or notice or anything like that this has occurred, surely then the regulations as published currently are not valid per the laws of the country. Or am I completely wrong and barking up the wrong tree? So yeah, that's my thoughts. Would appreciate comment. And this is not a thing that I want to, change anything. I just want to know, have I read it wrong? And where have I read it wrong? And do the documents exist that support the National Council of Provinces having this kind of oversight or not? And yeah, I suppose more, what is the actual state of affairs from a constitutional point of view regarding the promulgation of regulations by the National Command Council? Yeah, that's it. I hope it was interesting for some of you as well. And I encourage you, I will post the links to the relevant acts as well, so that you can take a quiz and look for yourself and see what is there, and I always believe, question everything. And then just a final disclaimer, please, 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 we're still in lockdown regs. Don't use this as an excuse to go and break them. I just want honest legal opinion. That's all. Stay safe. Love you all.